Again, my name is Chris Evans. I also have Kevin Rolling and Nick Seaton today. We're all three going to be presenting on some different aspects of research that's underway right now that deal with invasive species. Just as an outline, we're going to start with UAVs for invasive monitoring and then jump into some control research, specifically on 3 different major invasive species here in Illinois. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin and Nick to start with the UAVs. So let me stop sharing my screen and let them share theirs.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm Nick Seaton, project coordinator with the River Cooperative Weed Management Area.
And this is Kevin Rolling, forestry research technician with University of Illinois Extension Forestry.
All right, yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the strengths and weaknesses of UAV or drone captured imagery for Lonicera or bush honeysuckle infestations. A little background on the River Cooperative Weed Management Area. This is a formalized partnership between 13 federal and state agencies, not-for-profit organizations and universities. This was originally established in 2006, and since then has had a full-time project coordinator. All this is managed under the Shawnee RC&D, which is a not-for-profit organization. And some of the objectives of the River Cooperative Weed Management Area include education and awareness, organization and capacity building, coordinated control efforts, and research and applied methods. So these are some of the products on the left, bottom left here. We have the management of invasive plants in Southern Illinois, and also the identification guide of Southern Illinois invasives. So both of those are available at the rtrcwma.org website. And then on the side here, we have one of our training days, what it looks like. This was at Giant City earlier in the year. This is a zoom in of the CWMA, and so this operates in the southern 11 counties, and you can see all the other CWMAs throughout the country too. They're scattered around the Great Lakes and other states as well. Just a recap on what invasive species are. I know Chris had mentioned there's other presentations. This is just a quick recap. They're out of place and out of balance species that come here with competitive advantages. They don't have natural checks, and they can come in multiple taxa. What we're talking about today a lot are plant invasives, but there's also insects and fungal pathogens that are considered to be invasive as well. Down here in Southern Illinois, this is a really unique region. And so this is the confluence of 4 physiographic regions. We have the Illinois Ozarks, Mississippi River bottomlands, the Shawnee Hills, and the Coastal Plains Division that all join right here, making it really unique and some interesting flora that appears. And so we have some photos here. This is a photo from the Pine Hills overlooking the Mississippi River bottomlands. We have Little Lusk Creek from the Shawnee Hills. These are the Cretaceous Hills out of the Coastal Plains Division, where acid seep springs appear, creating really, really interesting floral arrangements and some rare species that occur in these areas. Some of the photos from Big Creek in the Greater Shawnee Hills. You see these rock outcroppings in the creek there. This is from War Bluff, another area found in the Shawnee Hills with these large outcroppings, really, really dramatic scenery. And finally, we have cypress tupelo swamps. So we have plants that are coming up from the coastal areas right into the northern extent of their range. And so making for some really, really fantastic photography. with all this unique area in Southern Illinois, it makes sense that there would be a conservation effort down here too. So we have the Shawnee National Forest. There's 3 national wildlife refuges, 15 state parks, 22 state natural areas, 10 non-government organizations, with the Nature Conservancy and Illinois Audubon Society being a few. Thousands of acres of conservation easements have been made, and there's over 2,000 species of flowering plants just in this area alone. Hundreds of, over 100 state threatened and endangered species, and over 62% of the species that occur here are considered to be in the greatest need of conservation. This over here on the right is some of the areas of public and private land, both state and federal, within the Southern Illinois region. Now, a lot of our focus recently on some of our work has been on private lands. And the reason being is that many of these private lands are enrolled in forest stewardship programs. And these forest stewardship programs, these properties are very diverse, and many threatened and endangered plant species have been found on them. About 25% of all the rare occurrences down here have been found on private lands. And in addition, there's lots of public and private interface where 28% of these properties are touching natural areas. So what we've done is focused our attention in these natural areas, in these areas called stewardship clusters. And so these are the areas that are outlined in black. That's where a lot of the attention has been made recently because of that public to private interface. Some of the outline on the project that we're going to be talking about today, Kevin will be talking more about the drone surveys, but we also have some endangered and threatened plant surveys, and there was some cost share funding that came along with the project. This is all through a landscape scale restoration project, which is federal funding with the Forest Service. We have 2 students through SIU that are going and contacting private landowners and going out to survey their properties for speculative rare plant populations. We're using the Chicago Botanic Gardens protocol to monitor and document the populations when they are found. And so this is a photo of us doing one of our training days and learning how to properly document these populations once they are located. So some photos here of some rare plants that are that have been located since the project started. We have found last season, we visited 18 sites and located multiple new rare populations. So we have rare orchids and species that are in the buttercup family. These are some more listed species, the styrax on the right and salvia on the left. And so this is really, really good information to be adding to the database and our knowledge base down here in the region. There's flowering azalea on the left there. Oxalis illinoisensis on the left again, and some interesting coastal plains plants on the right. But there are some invasive species that come in too, and so that's what we've been taking advantage of with these drone surveys. These conspicuous characteristics throughout the growing season where these plants display an interesting phenology. So you can see here on the left, this bush honeysuckle really highlights itself during the part of the year. And then on the right, again, the Paulownia, the princess tree with those purple flowers, easily identifiable from the air. And again, we have the silvery sheen of autumn olive, and then some of the last year's thatch of Lespedeza in the foreground there. And this was taken in the spring. You can see the red buds in the picture. And so then we also have burning bush and Bradford pear. So these are all species that can be identified from the air. And so taking advantage of what they look like at certain times of the year is what Kevin and I and Chris have all been working on.
All right, thanks, Nick. And with that, I'm going to jump in. So what I'm going to talk about today is the pilot project that we have been conducting over the last year and a half or so, where we are investigating the value of this drone captured imagery to identify bush honeysuckle in the understory. And then at the end, we'll talk about some other potential uses. But for identifying the bush honeysuckle in the understory, we kind of went at it from a twofold approach. First, we captured as much imagery as possible from as many sites as possible when we considered the timing was optimal for that image capture. And then we also conducted a trial comparing the drone captured imagery and the surveys from those images to on the ground surveys where we used GPS devices to document the locations of individual bush honeysuckle. And then we compared the results between the drone survey and the on the ground surveys. So after I go through that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the limitations and the strengths of this technology and some of the future directions that we might take it. So some of the equipment and software we used a DJI Phantom 4 Pro drone. We used the Drone Deploy online application for our imagery capture and processing. And then we used Esri's ArcGIS and the collector app for some of the field work and some of the visual assessments of the imagery. And I included some of the prices there just in case anyone else was considering doing something similar to what we've executed. And I'd be happy to talk more with someone after the talk if they're interested in more information about that. So the basic process for collecting the images, we use Drone Deploy, but there are a number of other applications that could be used. Basically, with Drone Deploy, we're able to draw a polygon around our site or the area that we want to be flown. And then Drone Deploy helps set up this flight plan or flight path. And then as the drone flies over the flight path, it captures many individual images. So then there's a few things you might consider when you develop your flight plan. We're not going to get into too much detail, but some of the factors include the overlap of your images, the altitude of your flight, and then terrain elevation can be a factor, and the direction of your travel. Once the imagery is collected, then we take it back to the office, we upload it onto the computer, and then back into Drone Deploy. And Drone Deploy uses an algorithm to then stitch all of those individual images together and create sort of a base map with the background imagery in place. Just an example here, this is one of the earlier images that we collected. We started collecting imagery in the fall of 2018, just after we acquired the drone, and continued through the fall of 2019. We flew 44 flights over 20 properties and collected over 18,000 images over around 6,000 acres in that time. Just one thing I just wanted to point out in this image, even though there's a lot of canopy leaves on the trees, you can still pick out a few things just from a real basic visual inspection. For example, right over here, kind of center right, there's a really bright red shrub, and that is, of course, a burning bush. So even with less than ideal conditions, there's information here that you can gather from this imagery. So in terms of testing the efficiency and accuracy of this process, we divided some areas out at Dixon Springs Ag Center into 13 5-acre blocks. And we captured imagery twice in November 2018 and then again in April of 2019, and went through the process. So identifying bush honeysuckle from the drone imagery once we uploaded it into GIS. And then we also conducted these walking on the ground surveys using handheld GPS collector app, and then again brought it back into GIS on the computer so that we could compare the two. So one of the big pros about this method is the efficiency. So when you compare the amount of time it took us to do the on-the-ground surveys versus the time it took to conduct the drone surveys, 11.6 hours versus 1.9 hours. So each 5-acre block took about 6 to 10 minutes for the drone surveys versus 30 to 75 minutes, which was pretty variable for the 5-acre on the ground surveys. And then a little bit of additional time for creation of the database, image processing, and so on. But a very significant difference in time. The problem comes in when we started looking at the accuracy of this method. So in 2018, which was our first big attempt, we determined the timing was absolutely critical. So we flew some flights in early November, and then we had a lot of stuff going on kind of in mid-November, and we weren't able to get back out until later in the month. And so the early photographs or images that we captured appeared to have too many canopy leaves to have a really good assessment. And then during the later time period, most of the canopy leaves had fallen, but also the bush honeysuckle leaves in large part had either dropped or had browned out. And then in the spring, we tried again because at that time, of course, the bush honeysuckle comes out, leaves out a little bit before the canopy, but we still had some pretty significant interference between spring bud emergence and some early leaf out. And in the fall of 2019, we tried to address some of those concerns, and we were basically flying throughout the entire month of November. But we still ended up running into a lot of the same issues, and it's probably variability year to year and from site to site, and even from species to species of these canopy trees, some of which will hold on to their leaves much longer. This image is from mid-November out of Trail of Tears State Forest. What we thought was going to be the optimum time turned out to be a pretty full canopy still. So it was rather difficult to pick things out. So another thing we came to find out was there were some errors in terms of identification of bush honeysuckle using the drone imagery. So some of the things that I picked out visually ended up being Japanese honeysuckle and a couple autumn olives, for example. And the most significant factor to me was that we were not able to capture with the drone the smaller individuals or individuals that had been top killed by fire. So in this image here, the red dots are the bush honeysuckle locations that were picked out in on the ground surveys, and the large green dots were areas that were picked out using the drone imagery for bush honeysuckle locations. So you can see pretty significant differences in there, probably the top left being the most varied, and then sort of the bottom right 5-acre block more or less coinciding with each other. So there is quite a bit of variability there. So we're still working on improving the timing, but this difference between being able to see visually these much smaller individuals and top-killed individuals, we probably won't be able to change with differing our timing. So in addition to the timing issues, we also are conducting these flights around the same time as some of our busy seasons for land management that often coincides with burn season, spring weed spraying, and so on. The weather also needs to cooperate, so you have to have pretty good conditions for drone flying, no precip, no high winds, that sort of thing. It can make scheduling difficult. And then, of course, issues with the canopy trees, leaves that are trees that have a high level of marcescence, or in other words, retain their leaves later into the season, or evergreens, of course, are going to be a problem for viewing down into the understory. Then we also had some image processing areas errors related to elevational differences we figured out. So in sites where we had large elevational gradients, the application that stitches the imagery together sometimes had issues with doing so with those elevational gradients. So we had to adjust some of our options for that. The strengths of this technology are that it provides for very rapid assessments, can save a significant amount of time and resources if some of those limitations can be addressed. It might be better for identifying rapidly core infestations that are going to be more visible under the canopy. And it's a low-cost survey option for people who may not have resources for more in-depth survey. It also provides access to remote areas and difficult terrain. So this image here is a picture of the swamps of LaRue Pine Hills leading up to the bluffs there in the background. So both of those habitats provide challenges to on-the-ground surveys, whereas the drone could easily access those types of places. Some future directions, we're going to continue working on optimizing our timing. Some other possibilities for this technology, in addition to invasive monitoring, include canopy damage monitoring, whether that's storm damage or potentially emerald ash borer canopy damage, delineating wetlands, barrens communities, and for planning different types of management. Some other species that are under consideration for the monitoring include, as Nick mentioned before, the princess tree or Paulownia. In this top left image, you see some of the Paulownia here that's in bloom, really sticks out. It's these really kind of light colored areas in this image. So that definitely has some potential. Calorie pear, I think, is another one that will be a lot like that. And then some of these other species are in different types of habitat or grow above the canopy, so we won't have those issues of looking below the canopy. So things like Oriental bittersweet and kudzu are going to be up in the canopy, so we won't need to look through it. Phragmites, Johnson grass, some of those more open areas, invasives, are more likely to show up more readily in our imagery. We also have been discussing acquiring a multispectral camera, so a camera that can allow us to visualize some of the wavelengths that we would otherwise not be able to see. So infrared or thermal imaging might allow us to pick out more species in the understory. And then following from that, we are considering an herbicide applicating drone. This, of course, would be a different drone, much larger, but it could be very useful in forest management for species like kudzu and some of those more open land species. And just to close out, I wanted to show you a few images here. This is one from a high quality land and water reserve that had a glade area on the top of a hill, and you can really see where some eastern red cedar has started to encroach on the glade. And this would just be a red flag that some management might be needed on this site in order to maintain that rare habitat. And then we have another image here from a private landowner. This landowner was excited that the imagery was so detailed, he would be able to use it to help delineate his burn units so that those could be better mapped. And that is the end of our part of the talk. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end, but if not, we'll be happy to speak with you guys after the talk at some point.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Let's switch over to sharing my screen. And we'll keep on going with the talk. All right, so my section is focused on controlling some research on controlling 3 different invasive species. The first of which is Japanese stiltgrass. This is a major problem in the southern third of the state. It's an annual warm season grass that invades bottomland forest, riparian areas, and so forth. Very difficult to control infestations just because of its fecundity and its amount of seed that it produces. You can see sites like this where it can just overwhelm areas. And since this is an annual, it reproduces only by seed and has to come back every year by seed. So that gives us some advantages to control. So what we were interested in looking at with this one specifically was to determine the effectiveness of pre-emergent herbicides for treating Japanese stiltgrass. And so pre-emergent herbicides, of course, are ones that work on seeds that they're trying to germinate. And focus on those. So perennial plants or plants that are already germinated are not impacted by these. So we wanted to look at different herbicides and different rates and how well they work for controlling stiltgrass, but also were there any non-target impacts. So our study design for this was we had 2 by 5 meter plots with 3 replicates per treatment and a very heavy stiltgrass infestation. We applied the herbicide in spring just before germination, and then collected visual estimation of percent cover for stiltgrass and for native vegetation at 1, 2, 4, and 6 months after treatment. We had several different herbicides we were looking at here that are all pre-emergent. So Esplanade 200 SC, Esplanade Sure, Oust, and Prowl H2O are the ones that we really focused on for this. And so you can see our treatments here. We had an untreated control, 2 different rates, a 5 and a 7 ounce per acre rate of Esplanade, a 3, 4.5, and 6 ounce per acre rate of Esplanade Sure. And then we looked at a tank mix between 5 ounces an acre of Esplanade plus Oust XP at a half, 1, and 2 ounces. Oust XP by itself at 2 ounces per acre, and then Prowl H2O at 4 quarts an acre. This is the site that we were working on. It's actually an old ash plantation that was just overwhelmed with Japanese stiltgrass. This is at Dixon Springs Ag Center. You can see even though there's a heavy infestation of Japanese stiltgrass, there are some native species making their way in there. And so we came early spring, right at just before the point of germination. And actually some were just starting to germinate at that point. So we tank mixed a little Roundup to kill any ones that just were starting to germinate, and then applied our pre-emergence herbicides in each of these plots. And then just monitor them and watch them develop. And so this is what the site looked like kind of mid-season as the stiltgrass was really taking off. Since this is a warm season grass, it does tend to delay itself and really get going midsummer. And you can see here our 2 by 5 meter plots really outlined clearly in these sites. And then just another one, kind of our outline plots you can see here loaded down with stiltgrass all around it. So we found, this is the results we found in terms of control of stiltgrass. And so just to explain it a little bit, going from left to right in each one of these columns, it's 1 month, 2 month, 4 month, and 6 months after treatment. So you can see the untreated, it pretty quickly rose up to 90% or so stiltgrass cover and stayed there throughout the season. The 2 Esplanade treatments initially had good control where we had low, 1 month after we had low stiltgrass cover, but it didn't last very long. So they quickly came up to 60 to 70% stiltgrass cover within 6 months. The same thing for Prowl H2O. And then the Esplanade Sure and the Oust treatments really worked well to control stiltgrass, particularly Oust. There was basically no stiltgrass for the entire season. Anything that had Oust in there. Esplanade Sure, even by the end of the season, it was mostly still under 10%. So this is really only half the story though. Just looking at control, we really wanted to see what happened with the native vegetation. And so just looking at this graph here is 6 months after treatment. It compares the cover of stiltgrass with the cover of native vegetation. You can see in the untreated, we had very, very low amount of native vegetation and high amounts of stiltgrass. Both esplanade treatments were the same, where we had heavy stiltgrass, though we still had quite a bit of native vegetation, and then prowl is the same thing. What to take home from this is that our native vegetation suffered quite a bit with anything that had oust in it, where there wasn't any really recovery from that, or even the higher rates of esplanade sure in there as well. And so we found that some of these had really good control of stiltgrass, but our natives were impacted pretty heavily. The two that seemed to do the best was the 3 ounce and the 4.5 ounce rates of esplanade sure, where we still had under 10% stiltgrass, and we saw recovering levels of the native vegetation over 10%, close to 20% of stiltgrass. One of the big issues with oust XP as well that we found was overland flow with rainfall following our treatments. You can see here these streaks coming out of our plots. This is where subsequent rainfall, even a week or two after our treatments, moved the pre-emergent herbicide outside of our plots and moved them off site. And so that's just the potential for non-target damage. So that's why we're concerned after this of oust XP is probably not our best choice. So just in summary for stiltgrass, Esplanade 200 SC and Prowl H2O were largely ineffective at controlling stiltgrass long term. We only saw short 1 to 2 month control of stiltgrass, but it recovered after that. Any of our treatments that included oust XP was extremely effective at controlling stiltgrass, but it was at the expense of some heavy non-target impacts and the potential movement on site. And the one that we found had the best control was Esplanade Sure at 4.5 ounces per acre. We had really good stiltgrass control, and it seemed to minimize the impacts of native vegetation. We're actually going to look at these plots again this year to see if there's any residual control in year 2 and see what they look like with that. Moving on to our second species is garlic mustard, another high priority. This one's across the state. It's a biennial forb and a major issue in our forest and woodlands across the whole state. And if you're not familiar with garlic mustard, you know, it produces the seeds like you see here on the right. Heavy seed producer, and that's how, since it's a biennial, that's how it's spreading and continuing its population. And many of the conventional control recommendations for garlic mustard say that you can make herbicide applications in the spring to the foliage up until the point, you know, when the plants are in their rosette growth stage or they're starting to bolt, or anytime prior to spring flowering. And so people thought that once they flower, at that point in time, you're not going to kill those plants. You have to switch to hand pulling. What we were interested in looking at was, can we do treatments that are made later than is normally recommended, so past the start of fruit development, and can they still be effective? We know there's already seed getting made in there, but will those seed be viable? And the idea behind this is trying to expand that spring treatment window, where we can continue using herbicide later in the spring than we normally do now, since herbicide applications is often more time effective than just hand pulling everything. And so with this one, we had 4 feet by 15 feet plots, 3 to 4 replications in a randomized complete block layout. And we did this at 3 naturalized Midwestern populations, 1 in Illinois and 2 in Wisconsin. And we looked at 3% glyphosate, 1% triclopyr, and then an untreated control. And those are just 2 of the common recommendations for this species. So we made all treatments with a single boom sprayer calibrated to deliver around 30 gallons per acre. And the idea is we watched the garlic mustard and we waited until there were green fruit on them and the last petals of the season were starting to fall off, way later than we typically spray garlic mustard. So for our Southern Illinois site, then that was May 7th in 2018. And in our Wisconsin sites, that was May 27th in 2017 and May 31st in 2018. So here's a shot on May 1st of 2018 in Southern Illinois, 1 week before we treated the plants. And you can see there's still some flowers on them, but underneath the flowers, there's already a lot of full green sleeks, fruit pods, kind of already being formed on the plants. We gave them 1 more week after this before spraying them. And so this is 2 weeks after treatment with 3% rate of glyphosate. It really browned these plants up very quickly. Even though the seed pods are still on there, they were still formed. We found triclopyr was a lot slower. So 2 weeks after treatment, you can definitely see the plants are impacted. They're starting to wilt down, but there's still plenty of seed on them. And it took about 6 weeks after treatment to really completely brown them up. Again, still seeds on there, and since this is a biennial, we don't necessarily care about killing the plants. What we care about is stopping seed production. And so after each plants were fully dry, we cut and bagged 3 plants from each plot. We dried them in paper bags until the seed pods were fully dry. And then we collected and weighed all seed to get an estimate of the total number of seeds per plant based on a subsample. And then tested that subsample of seeds for viability using a tetrasolium test to see which ones were still alive. And we found varying results by site, but overall at all 3 sites, we found a significant reduction in the amount of viable seed in garlic mustard from our treatments. So for our Fitchburg, Wisconsin site, untreated was just under 1,000 seeds, viable seeds for the 3 plants for untreated, and then triclopyr and glyphosate both reduced it way down. I think triclopyr reduced it by 84% and glyphosate by 70%. For the Prairie du Sac, Wisconsin, it was even more pronounced, where untreated controls were almost 4,000 seeds for those 3 plants. And then triclopyr was reduced by 98% and glyphosate by 86%. And then we had really good control here at Dixon Springs, where we had nearly 1,300, 1,400 seeds per 3 plants for untreated control, and almost 0 viable seeds on either the triclopyr or the glyphosate treatment. It basically completely eliminated any viable seed production. It was interesting that triclopyr was slower acting. It took longer to control, but it in general did a better job at rendering those seeds non-viable than the more faster acting glyphosate applications. So we found with that, late treatments of both glyphosate and triclopyr were very effective at reducing the amount of viable seed. There was some variation depending on when on the sites. This may be due to slight differences in the phenology stage they were at when they were treated, or a little bit of differences in the weather. It is good to note that in all 3 cases, it did not completely eliminate seed production. So this shouldn't be your primary control method, but it did significantly reduce seed production such that we think it is viable at the end of your normal spray seasons when the flowers are giving way to fruit. As long as those fruit are still green, fleshy, the plants are still actively growing, you should be able to control them at that point in time and render the vast majority of the seeds non-viable. So this should give us another 2 to 3 weeks extra spray window in the spring than we normally do right now. And then just our last research project here was on Amur honeysuckle. So this is one of several bush honeysuckles that are invading the Midwest. It's the one that's the most abundant across Illinois. I consider it one of the highest priority invasive species for Illinois, simply because of the level of damage it can do, the heavy shade it casts, the impact to even high quality intact forest. It's a major issue for us across the state, major impactful both to native flora and native fauna. So it's one that we should definitely control, and we're all familiar with it. You see it, it's flowering right now in southern Illinois. So again, just some conventional control recommendations. Cut, stump, or foliar applications are usually what happens with glyphosate, which is proven to generally be very effective, or triclopyr, which is often used, but there's been very mixed results with triclopyr. Some people say it's the go-to. Other people say they've had a lot of failures and lost control efforts using triclopyr. So we were interested in looking at triclopyr and testing it more in a controlled situation to see if we found those same level of varied results that we've seen anecdotally or observationally. And we were looking specifically this time as a foliar application herbicide for Amur honeysuckle. And then we also wanted to look at a few other herbicide options for treatment of honeysuckle, ones that are not normal herbicides for this, or not normally recommended, but we want to see how well they looked at. And then specifically, we didn't want to just look at defoliation, because no, that's not the whole story. So we also wanted to look at mortality and then across multiple years. So we actually took 2 years of treatment with this, knowing that sometimes there's reports of a species, a plant looking completely dead in year 1, but that you come back in year 2 and it's still growing and it kind of came back to life. So for this one, we did individual plant treatments. So an individual plant was a full treatment replicate there, where we looked at them in alone. We had 9 replicants for each of our treatment type, and we sprayed these in the late summer or early fall of 2017. And then we measured percent defoliation at 1 and 2 years after treatment, as well as at the end of 2 years, we calculated a rate of mortality, which mortality for us equaled 100% defoliation, no active leaves growing after 2 years after the treatment. And so our treatments were a standard kind of 3% triclopyr application, and so we used Garlon 3A. And then we looked at a couple different herbicides, new ones, Method 240 at quarter, a half, and 1% volume to volume rates, and then Milestone at a third of a percent, and then also looked at untreated controls. And so if you look at 1 to 2 years after treatment for this, you can find a lot of variation going on there, and this is average percent defoliation, so of course the higher the better. So our untreated controls, year 1 and year 2, they were both around 10% defoliation. That's just some natural leaf loss. Milestone was under 30% defoliation, so it just knocked a few leaves off year 1 and year 2. Garlon, we found that year 1 there was about 50% defoliation, but by year 2 it had recovered some already, and they were on average down to 30% defoliation. And then as you kind of creeped up on Method, the percentage, you got more and more defoliation, and the 1% Method rate was close to 100% defoliation in year 1, and by year 2 it was still at 95% defoliation. So you can see here, 3% triclopyr 2 years after treatment. You can see there's some dead patches of this honeysuckle, but by and large, there's still a lot of foliage on this honeysuckle, and it is definitely not on the path to mortality here. Whereas things like a 1/4% Method, the light rate, we saw the same thing here, where 2 years after treatment, this one was still largely alive. But once you got to that 0.5%, 2 years after treatment, there wasn't a green leaf on these plants. They were crispy. And even the 1 year, 1% 2 years after treatment of the Method 240, that 1% rate, these plants were already breaking down and falling apart by that time. It is interesting to note that what came in after treating them with Method and treating any of these was Japanese chafflower and Japanese stiltgrass, unfortunately. So if you look at the mortality rate 2 years after treatment, we found that it was just right at 10% for Garlon 3A as a foliar application. Untreated control, none of our plants died, of course, and Milestone was just around 10%. So both of those were very ineffective at controlling these for 2 years after treatment. The low rates of Method at a 1/4% and even a 0.5% were not very effective, but when you got to that 1% of Method, you were inching up there at 90% control, which is closer to what we would want. And we didn't add glyphosate in here because it was kind of a proven one. I wish we did add it now just to compare, but it would be likely from past studies somewhere around that 90 to 95% control as well. So what we found with the honeysuckle summary here of this work is that we did find that triclopyr as a foliar treatment was largely ineffective on Amur honeysuckle. We did have an initial defoliation, but almost every plant that was treated sprouted and continues to grow. And so while it looked good at first, it did not meet our objectives of killing these plants. The same thing with milestone. It was largely an ineffective method of control honeysuckle. We found that method 240 was pretty highly effective at the 1% rate. And then the lower rates were not as effective and didn't kind of meet what we would consider a successful treatment. The one thing about method, if you are familiar with that herbicide, is that there is some chance of or worry about non-target impacts, it moving to adjacent plants. And so we looked at that, we monitored adjacent plants, especially trees for impacts. And at year one, we did see some leaf curling on some of the adjacent trees. But by year two, there was really no pattern we could find of any non-target impacts. So we thought at this rate, at individual plant treatments, we didn't see anything to indicate that there was going to be a large-scale worry of non-target impacts. I would be concerned if you were broadcast spraying it or spraying heavy infestations fully with a higher rate of method, then you do have an opportunity for some non-target impacts. So while it's probably not the herbicide that we would recommend as the first choice, I still think glyphosate is your best bet to go with honeysuckle initially. It can be another tool in our tool chest that seems to be effective in the right situation. I will note that this study was done in with the application in 2017. We were under a bit of a drought stress. And so that may have impacted some of our control of these species, though we do have some colleagues in other states that did the same exact treatments, and their findings mirrored what we found. So it seems to be the patterns are the same, even though I think our overall control was a little lower, and that's probably due to us treating this in a drought situation. And so those were three different species control research that we underwent, and hopefully it kind of helps inform some of our future management ideas and plans. And with that, it looks like we have 8 or 9 minutes left for some questions. Again, you can put those in the chat box, and we'll see how many we can get to. And I think, Ryan, are you gonna find us some questions and read out the best ones for us?
Yeah, sure. Really great questions left in the chat box. Thanks to everybody that participated. But the first of those, Chris, would be considering that nature abhors a vacuum. When invasive species are culled from a given area, what can be done to replace the native species that ought to be there? Do our native populations stand a chance?
That's a good question, and I'll start, and then if Kevin and Nick want to jump in, they certainly can. And in many cases, yes, some other times it's other invasive species that come back in, and but not always. I think it really depends on the quality of the site, the seed bankability, the existing plants, and of course, the earlier you can get invasives out of a system, the less impacted they are, and the higher opportunity for recovery of the native species. But overall, we usually try to incorporate good, solid management practices for other types of management along with invasive species control. So in our forest across the state, our upland forest, that typically is looking at things like adding a little more light to the understory, doing prescribed fires to stimulate our native species, things like that to get our systems in the right trajectory. So when you control the invasives, you're upping the chance to get good recovery of the native species. And then with any invasive species, it's going to require multiple treatments to control those populations. So my take is, yeah, we absolutely we have a chance to control them, and we've seen a lot of good examples of recovery and restoration of high quality sites through invasive species control and other management.
Well, very. This next question is probably for Kevin. It's related to the drone photography. And the question is, have you ever tried using multispectral platforms for image capturing like MicaSense cameras?
Thanks. Good question. And yeah, we have not tried that yet to date, although I've seen a few other studies and talks recently that are using that and have been successful with, especially with some open land species. So that is something we're considering. They are pretty pricey, and we might have to write another grant, but definitely that's something we're considering.
And the next question is probably also to you, Kevin. What algorithm are you using to stitch and process for image correction?
Actually, what we do is we upload our imagery to the drone deploy application, and there are other competitors to drone deploy, but they're the service that we use, and they use their algorithm to stitch it together and feed it back to us. So I'm actually not sure what algorithm is being used to process our imagery. It's a little bit over my head, unfortunately.
Okay, on that same note, one more on the drones. What was the altitude of your flights?
We tried flying at various different altitudes. We found flying close to the limit, like around 280 feet or so, was the most efficient in terms of not having to capture as many images, and that it did not reduce the image quality that significantly, and it actually improved our results in terms of the ability of the service to stitch the imagery together. So we were typically flying somewhere around that 300-foot threshold.
Very good. A question probably for the whole group here. What is the success of spraying honeysuckle with an airplane?
Yeah, I can answer that. It's kind of outside of our research here, but there is a group in Illinois and then partners in Missouri and Iowa that have been researching this and doing it quite a bit. And they found pretty high success actually of doing aerial applications for bush honeysuckle, kind of in that same fall window that Kevin was talking about for doing the drone flights. You got to catch it just right, and some years it's harder than others. But they were doing those initial treatments for very inexpensive, which is the attractiveness of it. I mean, somewhere between $25 and $50 an acre, and getting 70–75% control that first round, and then even higher if you then spot spray in the spring or do a prescribed fire in the spring. So it's definitely a viable option for people, particularly that have heavy infestations.
That's great. Next question is on the range of stiltgrass in Illinois, and Paul answered in the chat box that stiltgrass has been found across Illinois. But any comment from you guys on the relative spread of or its prevalence around the state?
Yeah, so we're it's kind of heavily infesting the southern third of the state, but it's spotty farther north. I know it's farther in more counties than we have it mapped right now, but you're right, it's been found all the way up to the Wisconsin border. It's now been found in Iowa and in Michigan. So it's actively spreading, it's actively moving north, largely through people dragging it around. So equipment, recreational vehicles, horses, hiker shoes, that's kind of how it's moving around, and that's how it's going to spread long distances throughout the state. But I think anywhere in the state would be at risk of getting it, as it seems to still be actively expanding its range.
So a somewhat related question is, how long does the stiltgrass seed survive in the soil? So how long is it viable?
There's some varying research on that. Some people say up to 10 years. The best research I've found with that says that while sometimes some of the seeds can live a long time, 5 to 7 years definitely, on average, 80+% or more of those are going to germinate that first year. And so the vast majority of the seed are in that first year, and then a lot of them might germinate that second year. So even though some will last a long time, really that first and second year is the crucial part of replenishing that seed bank.
Very good. So another question regarding the herbicide studies you guys did. Are there any concerns regarding toxicity of the herbicides to local fauna or human populations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There always is if used incorrectly, and that's why we're looking at following label rates, making sure we use best management practices to reduce chance for exposure and things like that. The herbicides we're using tend to be on the lower toxicity level herbicides. And then again, we're applying them in methods and our timing and our rates to try to maximize safety to people and to non-target plants and animals as well.
So another question along those lines, have you tried the cut stump method with method?
No, we haven't. It'd be good to do. It'd be good to try other methods to looking at that herbicide. Right now, we just tried. We just tried this foliar spray with honeysuckle. Right now, we're just kind of getting into it, but we hope to kind of continue these types of research moving forward, where we're again trying to refine our control techniques and our options out there.
Okay, next question was, is buckthorn a big problem for our forests?
Yes, absolutely. Buckthorn is a big problem in the northern third or so of the state. I know that common buckthorn gets down probably all the way down halfway through the state, and it still is an issue. But it's probably public enemy number one when it comes to invasives in the northern parts of our state. Both common and glossy buckthorn are pretty bad.
Okay, another question on honeysuckle. With small honeysuckle, is it useful to pull them?
Yeah, so the nice thing about honeysuckle is that it is a shallow rooted plant, and so you can hand pull those pretty easily, the small ones, even the mid-sized ones, and that's definitely a viable control option.
Kind of similar question about garlic mustard. I've always tried just pulling up garlic mustard early in the season. Is this effective?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It just comes into a question of scale, right? There's so many you can pull per day, and there's a whole lot more you can spray. But absolutely, if you have small infestations or you want to go more chemical free, pulling garlic mustard is certainly a viable option. There is some risk about you're disturbing the soil and maybe providing good opportunity for other invasives to come in, but definitely hand pulling garlic mustard is a viable option.
Okay, back to our honeysuckle. Is 25% glyphosate still the recommended application for honeysuckle? And I'm assuming that is a foliar application.
It would not be for a foliar application. So 25% would be way too hot for a foliar application. So that would be a rate that you would use as a cut stump. And so we found in some other research getting all the way down, they've had effectiveness down to 15% or so. It's tough to present that data like that because there's a ton of different formulations of glyphosate. There's a ton of different strengths that you can get it in. The most common one is 40%, but there's a bunch of different ones. And so I'm always a little hesitant presenting exact, percentage solutions because it really depends on the herbicide you buy. And that just highlights that you need to read your labels and figure out what that label recommends as a method and as a rate, because each one's going to be mixed up a little differently. But at a high rate, a concentrated rate like 25% of a typical glyphosate, it would actually be ineffective as a foliar spray because it would end up actually burning the leaves off without translocating the herbicide down into the roots. That would be more of a cut stump rate you would use.
So a similar question for triclopyr. What is the percentage for a cut stump rate of triclopyr? And I think you probably have a similar answer.
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, it depends on the particular one you buy. I know you can get anything from, 8% solution that you would buy up to 50% solution. So you have to read the label and figure it out that way. There's a ton of different formulations out there of triclopyr.
Okay, with a quick run through of our questions, we've covered about all of them. I think there's one that's still in there for the drone research, and this would probably be a question for Kevin. Are the features being manually detected in the images from your drone, or are you using a machine learning algorithm like TensorFlow to automatically detect in images?
Yeah, good question. We are currently just using visual observation and creating our points for those, but that is something that we need to look into going forward to see if we'd have improved results using machine learning or unsupervised classifications of the imagery. So yeah, definitely that's something we need to look into.
Okay, another question, general question from earlier. With climate change, do we eventually need to accept change in native flora?
Good question. Definitely. So my take on that, and I'll definitely let Nick and Kevin add their points too, but my take on that is climate change is real. Things are going to be changing for sure. There's going to be movement of plant species around. But still with these invasives, they're typically from an area that they would have never made it here on their own, or regardless of climate change. There's too many barriers to migration, and we've seen that their impacts are pretty heavy with species loss and reduction of local richness in a site. So to me, with climate change, it probably highlights the need to control invasive species to maintain as much local native diversity as we can to give us as much resilience and adaptability to the changing climate.
Yeah, and to add to that, Chris, I agree with you what you said. And with native species, we can expect that there will be movement around, but with the non-native species, it's really, these are unprecedented changes that are putting a lot of pressure on our native populations. So that's why we want to still address that.
Alrighty. And I think with that, we are, unless there's any other questions that we need to get to, Ryan, I think we're at our time. And so we're gonna go ahead and sign off and stop this presentation, but I definitely would like to invite everybody here to continue on this series, starting tomorrow at 1 o'clock with aquatic invaders, and then throughout the rest of the week, we hope to see you at future presentations as part of our symposium series. Thank you all for attending.